أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون. لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون. إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون. وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون. وسواء عليهم أأنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون. إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم. إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين. واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون. قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون. قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين. قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب عليم. قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون. وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون. وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون. أأتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون. إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين. إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون. قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين. وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين. إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون. يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون. ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون. وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محذرون. وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها هبا فمنه يأكلون. وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وأعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون. سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون. وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون. والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم. والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالأرجون القديم. لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون. وآية لهم أنا حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أنطعم من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون ونفخ في السور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم أزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أعهد إليكم يا بني آدم ألا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لطمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنا يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسخنا على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ومن نعمره ننكسه في الخلق أفلا يعقلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على الكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وذللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم يرى الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقه قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون صدق الله العلي العظيم.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم إني أسألك وأتوجه إليك بنبيك نبي الرحمة محمد صلى الله عليه وآله يا أبا القاسم يا رسول الله يا إمام الرحمة يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك يا الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا الحسن يا أمير المؤمنين يا علي بن أبي طالب يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا فاطمة الزهراء يا بنت محمد يا قرة عين الرسول يا سيدتنا ومولاتنا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيهة عند الله اشفعي لنا عند الله يا أبا محمد يا حسن بن علي أيها المجتبى يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا عبد الله يا حسين بن علي أيها الشهيد يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا الحسن يا علي بن حسين يا زين العابدين يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا جعفر يا محمد بن علي أيها الباقر يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا عبد الله يا جعفر محمد أيها الصادق يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك يا الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا الحسن يا موسى بن جعفر أيها الكاظم يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا الحسن يا علي بن موسى أيها الرضا يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا جعفر يا محمد بن علي أيها التكي الجواد يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا الحسن يا علي بن محمد يا أيها الهادي النقي يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا أبا محمد يا حسن بن علي أيها الزكي العسكري يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا وسي الحسن والخلف الحجة أيها القائم المنتظر المهدي يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقه يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله حاجات يا سادتي وموالي إني توجهت بكم أئمتي وعدتي ليوم فقري وحاجتي إلى الله وتوسلت بكم إلى الله واستشفعت بكم إلى الله فاشفعوا لي عند الله واستنقذوني من ذنوبي عند الله فإنكم وسيلتي إلى الله وبحبكم وبقربكم أرجو نجاة من الله فكونوا عند الله رجائي يا سادتي يا أولياء الله صلى الله عليهم أجمعين ولعن الله أعداء الله ظالميهم من الأولين والآخرين آمين رب العالمين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. करबल की कहानी जो कोई भी सुनाएगा, दिल वालों की आँखों से एक दरिया बहाएगा। वो कारवां सरवर का जो शान से निकला था, सुगरा को खबर क्या थी, ना लौट के आएगा। मेहमान बुलाया है, एक कूफी ओ सरवर को, क्या कुंबा शहीदी का पानी नहीं पाएगा। पामाल हुआ कासी, यूं गोरों की टापों से किस तरह चचा तेरी मैयत को उठाएगा। था हाथों के कटने का कुछ गम ना दिलावर को, सैयदानियों का पर्दा अब कौन बचाएगा। टूटी है कमर शह की, घबराना मगर अकबर, फर्जंदे नबी तेरी लाशे को उठाएगा। करबल की कहानी जो कोई भी सुनाएगा, दिल वालों की आँखों से एक दरिया बहाएगा। मोहम्मदिन व आले मोहम्मद सल्लल्लाहु
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Respected scholar, my elders, brothers, sisters in Iman, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Surah Fatiha is requested for all the names listed on the screen and Kul Marhamin Al-Fatiha. Ayama Yujibun is requested for all the names listed on the screen and whoever is in need of it here and elsewhere. Let us all recite it together. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Amma yujibul mustarra idha da'ahu wa yakshifu su. Amma yujibul mustarra idha da'ahu wa yakshifu su. أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين شفيع المذنبين رحمة للعالمين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع نفوسنا وطبيب ذنوبنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المذلومين المنتجبين المكرمين الخيرين الفاضلين السيدين الصادقين سيما بقية الله في الأرضين روحي وأرواح العالمين للتراب مقدمه الفدا ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من الأولين والآخرين إلى قيام يوم الدين أما بعد صلوات على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Mu'mineen, mu'minat, brothers and sisters in Islam and Iman, Salamun alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Tonight we commemorate the Shahada of the sons of Muslim ibn Aqil, Muhammad ibn Muslim ibn Aqil and Ibrahim ibn Muslim ibn Aqil. I thought that we could take tonight to talk about the idea of azadari and how things will be changing for us in quarantine with COVID. Now, you and I have already gotten used to some degree, this new way of life. Ramadan was a challenge, no doubt, but we made it through, alhamdulillah. And of course, we're continuing our Thursday night programs, all of the wiladat, the shahadat, all the other Eids that we've gone through. We've been continuing with this online format. And of course, the Muharram program will continue as well. Some of you are finding it difficult, and I don't blame you. Obviously, it's difficult for me, just like it's difficult for you. However much it's strange or weird or tough for you to sit, behind your computer or laptop, TV or phone, watching a lecture, it's obviously equally, maybe even more so, difficult for me to be speaking to my laptop. There's a huge part of us, whether you're extroverted or introverted, we crave human interaction and we crave social environments, right? Especially for us as followers of the Ahlul-bayt, we have all of these different occasions throughout the year. At the very least, we would be getting together every Thursday, Fridays for Jum'ah, whatever it is. We'd get together and, we'd be learning. We would be benefiting from whoever the speaker was. Sometimes we listen to the masa'ib and gain barakah and benefit from that. Obviously, food, chai doesn't hurt. And then there was the social aspect, right? We would talk to one another. We would learn about what's going on in the community. So a lot of us are missing out on that part. This Muharram, we won't be able to go to the center. Many of you have seen the advice that has come from the office of Ayatul Sistani, Hafadhullah, may Allah protect him, grant him a long life, as well as all of our scholars, Maraji' and Urafa. And the advice of the Shia Council of Ulama of North America. Especially in a state like ours, in Florida, it's really not recommended for us to go and have these things in public. Still though, regardless of what your opinion is about, going in person or not, it's obviously going to be difficult to do this online. And I think perhaps the difficulty lies in the fact that we don't like when azadari, especially azadari, changes. Whether we are older or younger, we prefer to have one form of azad that we're used to, and we want to continue on with that. Most of us, whether we're young or old, are very reluctant to changing the ways that we've been doing things in terms of mourning and commemorating the Shahada of the Ahlul-bayt and Karbala and the episode of Karbala in general. Allah says in Surah Al-Hajj, chapter 22, verse 32, a verse that most of you are familiar with. He says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, at least a part of the ayah, وَمَن يُعَذِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِن تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. Whoever does ta'zim, whoever raises, honors the sha'a'ir Allah, the symbols of Allah, the symbols of God, فَإِنَّهَا مِن تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. All of these things come from and emanate and start from the taqwa of the heart, the consciousness that you and I have of Allah that resides in our heart, in our soul. We know that the month of Muharram is that as well. The azah that we do is a part of and an example of a sha'a'ir Allah. It's a symbol of religion. Probably the greatest symbol. What I want to do today is to help us transition into this different sort of azadari that we'll be starting. I wanted to go through a few different things. Because I know that it's going to be stressful for a lot of us, I want to give us a little bit of solace by looking at the history of the changes and evolution of azah from the beginning, meaning from the episode of Karbala all the way up to the present day. So I wanted to give a quick overview of that history. And hopefully by doing so, we'll see that azah has always been going through changes based on time and place. So our situation here will be no different. We just have to learn to adapt. After doing that, maybe if we have time, we'll try to go through some commonalities and maybe give some ideas about the different aspects of azah that we should try to make sure we implement and express in this holy month as we come upon Muharram, inshallah. And then of course we'll end with the recitation of the musibah and masa'ib of the sons of Muslim ibn Aqil alayhi salam. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So let's first look at the history of azah, of commemorating and mourning Imam Hussein alayhi salam. So sometimes historians divide it into 4 different stages. They first say that the first movement of commemorating and mourning the tragedy of Karbala was firstly right after the event, up until the next phase, which begins with the 5th Imam. After the 5th Imam, then you move up until the Buyid era. Then from the Buyid era, then the 4th and final phase, which starts our common era, present era, is from the Safavid Empire onwards. So I'm going to mention a few points about each of these eras, the kind of changes between each, and then we'll go to the present day. So the first phase is, of course, right after Karbala, meaning you can even say from Ghariba up until the time of the fifth Imam. So this, of course, is mainly being performed or commemorated by the Banu Hashim, right? The family, the Ahlul-bayt. They are the ones now holding these majalis, expressing and mourning and commemorating. So, of course, you see the major players here are Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, Bibi Zainab alayhi salam, Kulthum alayhi salam, Fatima Sughra alayhi salam, where they're going around with women and children, whoever was present there, as they're going from place to place, right? From Karbala to Kufa, from Kufa to Sham, from Sham back to Medina. This whole time, the major point seems to be telling people what actually took place in Karbala. In addition to that, not only were they giving them the difficult, torturous, harsh details about what took place, how the Imam Hussein alayhi salam and his friends and family became shaheed on Karbala and what exactly happened. Besides those details, they also sometimes would give sermons, right? They'd give these speeches. And in the speeches, which we're familiar with, I think, right, of the fourth Imam, of Bibi Zainab and the others, they would usually be explaining to people what their problems were and why their crying meant nothing right now. Right? We see, for example, when they're in Kufa and you see the Muslims crying, they say, what good are your tears now? We needed your actual support in Karbala and now you're crying. What good do you think your tears are? And as they would go to other places, they'd say, don't you know who we are? We're from the Ahlul-bayt. And this is what they did to us. So it seems to be two things then. One part of it is the actual history, and the other part seems to be this sort of motivational guilting or shaming of the people who would still support or were neutral towards what Yazid was doing. So this was pretty much the movement there. Again, we know that they were given time in Sham to mourn, to have quote-unquote this official sort of majalis. Then when they come back to Medina, they establish this idea. Imam Sajjad alayhi salam would go around explaining what would took place. He would be crying. So you see, it's a very emotional time, right? This is, if we want to give an analogy, it's almost for us, when we first hear about a loved one's death, we now call, let's say, everybody else in the family or everybody else, any of our friends, right? Or nowadays we send out the social media kind of messages, right? We say, look, my father passed away, my mother passed away, my grandparent, whoever it is. And we might give details about what happened. And, it's going to be very emotional for us. So that seems to be the major sort of idea there. Around this time, we also begin to see poetry being recited. The poetry recitation, though, was what? It's 2 points. It's about the historical part of it, about what took place, and about the emotional, stirring up emotions in those who were listening. These seem to be the major features and traits of this first phase of Azadari, which was from the tragedy of Karbala up until the time of the fifth Imam. Now, what happens when the fifth Imam comes? Let's discuss this time. So this is now, we're saying, the time from the time of the fifth Imam, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salatu wassalam. From his time up to the Buyid era, which is around the 900s or so. So now we come to the fifth Imam, right? So the Umayyads now have been weakened. We're slowly moving into the Abbasid era. This is now where before you didn't see formalized Aza, but the fifth Imam and the others, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, etc., they start to formalize the institution of Aza. So for example, what we see is, for example, in the various narrations, specifically one from the fifth Imam, he is now instructing the Muslims, specifically Shia obviously, but all Muslims in general, that they should be mourning over what took place to his grandfather, right, to Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and they should have gatherings in their homes. They should call people together. They should cry over Imam Hussein. They should invite poets, and poetry should be recited, right? So it seems to be the same exact messages from before, right? Recite the tragedy and recite poetry, the same things. What's interesting here is we don't really see, let's say, the speech part of it that you and I are used to in Muharram, right? We have speeches, which is, let's say, some sort of fada'il, maybe, history, spirituality, akhlaq, something. And then after that, we hear the kind of masa'ib part of it, right? And then poetry is in the beginning and the end. These gatherings initially seem to be just the musibah and poetry sort of back and forth or mixed together somehow. Very, very poetry centric. We see, for example, Kumail, when he comes to the house of the fifth Imam, he comes to Medina, the Imam tells him, start reciting poetry, right? Direct instructions from the Imam to start reciting poetry. In the sixth Imam, you see now the amount of poets have increased, so the amount of poetry recitation increases, not just in Medina. Now the poetry recitation, goes everywhere else, right? So the Shias in Sham, they're reciting poetry. The ones in Kufa are reciting poetry. Medina, Makkah, wherever they were, they're reciting poetry. During the time of the eighth Imam, right? We have Di'bil, the famous poet, who's reciting the famous words, right? The Imam is telling Di'bil, these are the days of our sadness, right? هذه الأيام أيام الحزن. These are the days of our grief and sadness. It's the best thing for you to do is you should be reciting poetry for us. So Di'bil would come and recite poetry, which would cause the Imam to cry and all those who attended to cry as well. So again, you see there's a specific special emphasis placed on the emotional aspect through the expression of poetry, through crying, shedding tears, right? This is all being raised up. You don't really see in these two periods the Imams speaking with historians. You don't see people saying, write down books of history, etc., etc. Right? You see more symbolic history, right? The tragedy through poetry. You don't see raw history books being written. Once we go to the next phase, then we start to see something a bit different. And this now is from the Buyid dynasty up until the Safavid dynasty. So again, we're talking about maybe like the 4th century Hijri, which is around like 930-ish CE, right? Or maybe like 1000 CE, something like that. So the Buyid era scholars and leaders, this is where they take it to the next step. Because now you see the Buyid dynasty was, you can call them Shias if you will, or at least Shia sympathetic. So now, when the month of Muharram comes along, right, or the time of Muharram, it's not just about in your houses have these gatherings, because now it's really the first time the Shias have control of the society, of the government, in politics. Now you see the Buyids, they begin implementing governmental, political, social policies. For example, on Ashura, what do? They tell people to commemorate in the streets, not in their homes, come out in the streets. Stores are ordered to shut down, or people will shut down. The kind of fancier, luxurious foods that people would normally eat the rest of the year, people won't be eating that, right, on Ashura. Whether it's, again, a part of the culture or whether it's the government telling the people that this should be a new part of the culture, that's up for a debate. I don't want to go into all these historical details, though it seems likely that the government was implementing these policies and people were following suit because they wanted to, right? Because now this was the first time they could go and outwardly share their love and commemorate out loud, express out loud their love for Imam Hussein alayhi salam and the Shuhada of Karbala, right? So everybody now is out. This is also where you begin to see this chest beating happening. Now, chest beating not in the way you and I are used to in our centers, meaning chest beating of somebody just like, like expressing pain outside. So it wasn't really as far as the kind of organized version of ma'atam that you and I are used to, right? Okay. So again, there's a lot of other historical details, but I'm not really, again, I don't want to go through the full history lesson, but this is also where now the raw history begins to be recited. So people now are trying to figure out what was the exact historical details, because now they're very far removed. And then they began writing these books called the Maqtal or Maqatil. What exactly took place in the tragedy of Karbala. So a lot of those historical books now you see, they've come a couple hundred years later. And in the morning gatherings, people would actually read these maqtals, right? These full historical accounts of what really took place. So you see a slight shift, right? Poetry now was still a part of it. They began expressing it outwardly, and now history now becomes a part of it as well. Now we can jump into the fourth and final phase, which is the Safavid era up into the present. So what happens then? Let's go through this. If you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Now, of course, with the Safavid era, again, you see a Shia government. right, based in Iran. One of the first things that they had done as far as changing or evolving the commemoration mourning ceremonies, the Aza and Azadari, is that previously, normally the government or people, meaning the Shias, would only really commemorate on Ashura, one day, that's it. We do have reports that some imams would, commemorate, quote unquote, on Ashura. Some would say, the 9th and 10th of Muharram. Some would do a few days, some would do 40 days, some would do years. See, one thing we have to understand is there wasn't a single method, even by the imams, right? The imams would even commemorate differently based on time, place, and the environment, and the Shias around them. This is the first time in the Safavid era that you see a government implementing this kind of policy publicly, that we should start commemorating, not just on Ashura, not just on the 9th and 10th, but they expanded it firstly to the 10 days of Muharram, the first 10 days. From there, then they gradually started adding on, let's say, another 2 days. So now we have the 12 days of Muharram. Then they added up to the full month of Muharram. Then they go from Muharram and Safar as well. So this is important for a lot of us to recognize and remember that our kind of current version of Muharram is a very recent phenomenon, commemorating all the way up until, as we call Eid al-Zahra, for example, right? That's a very, very recent kind of cultural phenomena. We don't really see the imams doing that, for example, right? Which doesn't mean it's wrong, obviously, right? But one of the points that I think we need to keep in mind is the same way we see the imams, their Aza evolving. We see that with different sort of Shia governments, Aza is evolving. We can also evolve our Azadari as well, right? This is one of the major points that I wanted to get across for us tonight, inshallah. So even the amount of time that it's commemorated, this idea of 10 days or 12 days or the whole month or 40 days, whatever it is, this was something that we see, at least history says, this is something that was started by the Safavids. We don't really see the imams fully encouraging this necessarily. Now, again, I'm not saying that it didn't exist then, but it wasn't this huge kind of cultural norm as we see today. You begin to see people spending a lot of money now to make sure that gatherings are large and successful, right? This is where you begin to see the introduction of alams, of flags, of tabut, right? The coffins, of using cradles to remember Ali al-Asghar, and other things, right? Other symbols that you and I are now used to in our kind of Indo-Pak or Desi culture. Or again, in other cultures, they have these as well, but in different versions. So these physical symbolic representations start in sort of this era. Also, we see the way that poetry was recited. Before, we know that the Arabs normally would just do spoken poetry. In this sort of Safavid era, the Iranians, they started to change poetry to, instead of spoken, making it a recitation with a tune, right? So again, this is a new change as well, a new kind of development. In addition, they would start to implement chest beating alongside the poetry, along melodic poetry with tunes. So this is now, we start to see what we're used to, right? People in groups, in circles, in lines, rhythmically, melodically reciting these poetries and these lines and things like that, right? So this whole new culture starts to develop there. And then this is where you and I see our kind of current day ideas. Now, as the Safavid sort of ideas spread out into different parts of Iraq and different parts of the Arab Peninsula, into India, Pakistan, etc., then slight little changes happened as well, right? Many of you know that in India and Pakistan, in the beginning, Aza was normally in Farsi, right? This was the normal language of Shiism, so to speak, right? Especially of poetry. Then later on, let's say through interference, right? British colonialism, etc., the languages begin to shift. And then you start to see, obviously, Urdu coming in and other languages. Again, I don't want to go into the kind of effect of colonialism and the British on the Azab, because that's a longer academic discussion. But even there, you start to see people, right? An elder group, a traditional group, and a newer group beginning to fight. Right? This reminds you of something maybe. The elders, or the traditional ones, were saying, look, we recite Aza in our language, which is Farsi. That should be the language we use. But the ones who were kind of born and raised, or much more connected to Urdu, or let's say the whatever language that they spoke in their area, whether it was Hindi or Gujarati, whatever it was, they started to say, no, we have to recite it in our own language, and we have to change the format for our own language, right? So of course the elders were saying, how dare you change our ways, and these younger kids were saying, no, we have to change it to the language of the time, etc. It seems like a sense of deja vu, right? Of course, because once that idea moves over here, now those same individuals were arguing for, let's say, to keep their own language like Urdu or Arabic or Farsi, and they didn't like when English got started. But of course, we all know that, what happened as far as that fight went back and forth. Khair. So now we're in the present day. In the present day, right now, kind of fast forwarding, we're dealing with this idea of COVID. We are used to going out and commemorating in a public sense and in a community sense, a communal sense, our love for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. What exactly are we supposed to do now? So I wanted to offer maybe some guidance in sense of some tips that maybe you and I can substitute certain ideas so that we can maybe have a more spiritual month of Muharram and Safar, inshallah. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Again, as a reminder, as we saw in the times of the Imams, up until the various different dynasties and empires, Azadari has been changing and evolving and transforming. One thing that we should remember, which is very, very important, very key, is that there isn't one right way of performing Aza. There are a lot of wrong ways, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of haram ways, there's a lot of, let's say, weaker ways or deficient ways, but to say that there's a wrong way, I don't know if that's, to say that there's a one single right way, that's very difficult. Very difficult. Even right now, we have people who are, again, very passionate because of the amount of love that they have for Imam Hussein alayhi salam and the shuhada, which is great. So they're passionate about wanting to go out in public, about wanting to have sessions in the center, about matam and other sha'ir, other symbols of azab. And your love is definitely to be commended. That's wonderful. We have to keep in mind the advice of our marajeh, the advice of our ulama, that right now it may not be in our best interest to come out and have these things publicly, right? Because of the safety of our community members. We see the same thing in history. When it wasn't safe for Shias to commemorate in public, they were told, okay, you can go to your homes. In the same way, right now, yes, you and I can't see each other in the center right now. Right? It's heartbreaking. But that doesn't mean that those physical representations of Muharram have to die. When we would go to the center, we would see certain things. Right? Now, certain things we brought to the table, other things we expected the center to kind of create the environment for us. So you and I would, of course, dress in black, right? Or dress in darker colors. We can still do that in the first, the 12 nights or however many nights you feel comfortable, or the whole, 40 days, whatever you want. You can dress in black the whole time. That's not going to change, right? Especially if, let's say, you're still doing your Zoom calls and things like that. This would be, for example, your way of commemorating and expressing it publicly. Because now in a Zoom call, if your colleagues are seeing that you're constantly wearing black, they may say something. And if you want to, I'm not saying you have to, but if it's something that you prefer to do, you can now express the tragedy of Karbala to others through this, because they'll see that, why are you dressing black all the time? Did somebody die? Right? Was there a death in your family? And then if you want to, you can then explain those things. So that part of Aza, which used to be us, for example, going out to the workplace, we can now do that just by, let's say, changing our dress or adjusting our dress for Zoom calls or meetings, etc. In terms of the center changing the environment, meaning the different sort of, call them Muharram or religious paraphernalia, meaning black cloth everywhere, flags and alams, things that say Ya Hussein or Ya Abbas, etc. If whoever does have them in their homes, well, many of us have the space where we can put that up, right? If you have a centralized location, let's say where you pray, maybe you have a azakhana, whatever, you can start, getting that ready. Many of you already have done that, and that's great. For those of you who have the space and haven't done it before, now is a perfect time to start. You can encourage your kids, right, to say that, why don't you? We can buy you, let's say, black construction paper, and you can make your own alam. You can make your own flag, design whatever you want, and put it up, in this specific area. so that they know and they're now active in expressing their love for Imam Hussein, right? So this is something that you can also implement as well. And of course, if you're going to, decorate your house, if you have black cloth or black fabric, then of course, it's good for you to get the whole family involved if you can do something like that. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. In addition, a lot of centers, when the Masa'ib and Musiba is being recited in the center, sometimes the center will, let's say, turn down or turn off the lights, right? Because, it creates a certain environment where it may be easier for us to connect, easier for us to shed tears, cry, and feel that pain in our hearts. We can do the same thing, right? Although it's difficult for us to, again, watch a Musiba or Masa'ib online, on our TV, whatever, maybe it wouldn't hurt, right? When the speaker begins to transition into the Masa'ib, you go and shut your own lights off, right? That may help in creating that environment within your house as well, right? So whatever, again, the general point is whatever you saw being done in the center, you can do the same thing over here as well in your own home. Those same things, just try to replicate them. There may be other parts as well. Let's say the kind of social aspect that you and I are used to of going out, getting part of organizations for, let's say, social justice or spreading out the message of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. This may be a bit more difficult, right? Because we have to be careful with our public presence. Now, of course, in the same way that, alhamdulillah, the organizations here had on Eid al-Ghadir, had this session where they were packing up these bags for the homeless. If the organizations here do decide to do something like that for, let's say, Ashura, then this is something, of course, you can get involved with as well, or you can do something on your own. Many of you are going to go out and you're going to be driving, right? Let's say to get groceries or whatever essential things you have to do. We know that in Orlando, there are plenty of people still on the streets. So even there, you can decide to help them out in whatever way you want, right? You yourself with your family, if you want to put together a small, let's say, bag, and put the message of Imam Hussein or a hadith or something like that, you can do that without having to wait for some sort of organization to do that for you. Now, it's great when organizations do the heavy lifting for us, but you yourself, let's say something simple, right? Sometimes they're asking for food on the streets. Sometimes they're asking for clothes, whatever it is. On a bottle of water, if you want to give it to them, right? The simple thing, you can write your own thing and pay, tape it on and give it to them. You can be creative, sit down with your family and think of your own ideas and do that as well. Again, to kind of summarize a way that we can make up for the lack of community presence right now is whatever the community was doing before, you can now sit down with your family and figure out, well, how can we do the exact same thing, but for ourselves? Because, and this will be the last thing to wrap up, although we are seeing this COVID-19 era as a detriment to our spiritual growth, and many of us are seeing it like that because we can't come out in public, in fact, it might reveal to us a spiritual deficiency that you and I have had for a long time. Many of us, our spiritual growth has been wholly dependent on what the community did, what the MC did, what these organizations did. And you and I wouldn't step forward and do it ourselves. Meaning, if there wasn't a specific drive or food bank or whatever done by these organizations, if the MC didn't organize efforts to take care of those who are not doing well in the community, if we didn't have a welfare committee, etc., then you and I sitting at home would probably do nothing. So we became very, very reliant on others, on organizations. But the problem with that is that we, one, distance ourselves from our own efforts and our own work, meaning you and I, the things that we should be doing on our own, we now become completely reliant and dependent on the community and on organizations. So it takes away our own sort of struggle and effort that we have to put in. And the other side is that sometimes we divorce ourselves and move away our relationship with our families. And many of you have recognized this, haven't you? In Ramadan, yes, we miss seeing all our friends and the community members in the center. But how many of you realized how much more connected you became to your own family because you spent those 30 nights with them, right, in Ramadan? Imagine now you can develop that same sort of closeness and connection with your family through the nights in Muharram. So focus again on yourself, on your family, and see what you can do together. Because if we really want to, once we do, inshallah, come out of this COVID idea and this COVID experience and whatever you want to call this whole dilemma and pandemic, the best way, the only way we can come out stronger is if we strengthen ourselves as individuals and as families. And we have to start looking inward. And this seems to be one of the major themes of Karbala itself. Is Imam Hussein alayhi salam and the Shuhada and the companions, they seem to have been calling out to everybody. The Shias, those who weren't Shias, those who were against them, every single person that they would interact with, they were calling out to them and saying, look at yourselves and look what you're doing with your lives. So perhaps this Muharram may be the most spiritual Muharram that we've ever gone through, because it's a direct call from us, perhaps, from Imam Hussein alayhi salam, from Bibi Zainab, from Imam Sajjad, from all of the Ashab, from all of the Shuhada of Karbala, a direct call for us to say, do you listen to our calls? Can you hear our calls? Fix yourself, and then maybe inshallah, we can become supporters and those who respond to the call of the Imam of the time, Ajjalallahu ta'ala farajuhu sharif. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. And I think it's very interesting that, we go through the musibah of the sons of Muslim ibn Aqil tonight, the night of their shahada, because you see that when a family can look inward, when a family creates this environment of spirituality in their house, age is just a number then. Many of us, sometimes we think about this idea of sacrifice, of commemoration, of tragedy, of ithar, of struggle, and we associate it with us being adults, right? We wait for our kids to become a certain age, and then we expect them to have, once they're young adults, for example, then they can start doing certain things. But one thing that the tragedy of Karbala shows us is that even the young among them, like the sons of Ibn Aqil, the sons of Muslim, 8 and 10 years old, right? Muhammad and Ibrahim. At such a young age, because of the tarbiyah, the parenting, the nurturing that they were given, because of the love that was instilled in their hearts, the love of Islam, the love of Allah, the love of Ahlul-bayt, they were able to achieve greatness. They were able to die for the cause of Islam. In the history books, they say that there's two different opinions, right? There's either that the sons of Ibn Muslim were with him in Kufa when he came and became shaheed like that, or taken captive like that, or the stronger opinion seems to be that the sons of Muslim ibn Aqil were with Imam Hussein in Karbala, then they were taken captive and they were put in jail when they were brought to Kufa. Many of you know the history. When they were put in jail, when the companions were, when they had been taken captive, when they were brought to jail, they were there for, according to some, 1 full year. 1 full year they were in jail, and while they were there, the reports say that they fasted all day. They were barely given any food and drink, but even in that situation, under those circumstances, they were fasting, constantly in prayer. 8, 10 years old, and this is the way that they express their connection to Allah. Not complaining, not crying, even things that you and I would barely be able to deal with. Look at how they become an example for you and I. They speak to the prison guard. After 1 year, then they realize that maybe they should gain their freedom by speaking to the prison guard. They tell the guard, Ya Sheikh, do you know the Prophet Muhammad? And he says, of course I know the Prophet Muhammad. He says, do you know Ja'far ibn Abi Talib? They said, of course I know him. They say, do you know Ali ibn Abi Talib? He says, of course I know who he is. They say, do you know that we come from that same family? The family of Rasulullah, the family of Abu Talib. We are the sons of Muslim ibn Aqil ibn Abi Talib. That's where we come from. And when this prisoner finally recognized, he didn't know who they were. When they recognized it, he gave them a chance to be free. He released them that night. He gave them instructions on what to do. The children ran away. They came across an old woman. They stayed with her. But the problem was the old woman, her son-in-law was somebody who had no love in his heart and only hate in his heart towards the Ahlul-bayt. That night, when Muhammad ibn Muslim and Ibrahim ibn Muslim are there sleeping together for the final night, they start expressing their love for one another and their care for one another. And the younger brother says to the older brother, he says to him, brother Bhaijan, can you come closer to me while we sleep tonight? Can you hold me closer? And can we sleep closer together tonight? In case that we die, I want to be together. This is the way that a brother is speaking to his other brother. Imagine if we can raise our siblings like this as well, with that kind of love. Unfortunately, the son-in-law shows up. He finds out that the sons of Muslim are in the house. He knows about the reward. He takes them. He orders his slave to go and end their life. As the slave goes and takes them to Al-Furat, the sons Muhammad ibn Muslim and Ibrahim ibn Muslim tell him, it's like, don't you know who we are? We are from the family of Rasulullah. The slave asks for forgiveness, and then he says, I will never do this job. And his master says, how dare you disobey me? He says, I'd rather disobey you than disobey Allah. And he runs away. This son-in-law then orders his son to go and kill the sons of Muslim. When the son now goes and speaks to the children of Muslim, he hears the same thing. They say, we are from the family of Rasulullah. The son tells his father, I will not disobey Allah. I would rather disobey you. And he runs away from his father as well. So now this torturous, this disgusting, this evil son-in-law, now he goes forward and begins to get ready to kill the sons of Muslim. They try their best to convince him otherwise, but he doesn't listen. He says, okay, if you will not spare our lives, will you at least give us permission to pray 4 rakats? And he says, do you pray whatever you want, it won't do you any good. And they begin to offer du'as and pray these 4 rakat prayers. At the end they say, Ya Hayyu Ya Hakim, Ya Ahkam al-Hakimin, Uhkum bayna wa baynuhu bil-haq. Ya Allah, you are Al-Hayy, you are the one who is ever living. Ya Hakim, you are the wise. Ya Ahkam al-Hakimin, you are the best judge. Judge between us and between him with truth. Look at how these young children are making dua in their last moments. Again, no cries, no complaints, nothing. Just leaving everything into Allah's hands. First, this mal'oon kills the elder brother, then he kills the younger brother, and he throws the bodies in the river. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Ridan biqada'ihi wa tasliman li amri. Ala la'natullah ala qawm al-zalimin wa saya'lamu alladhina zalamu ayya munqalabin yanqalibun. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, ye maatam, Shabir tera ye maatam, Shabir tera ye maatam, tahshir rahega jari, tahshir rahega qaayam, ye maatam, Shabir tera ye maatam, Shabir tera ye maatam, ye farsh aza ye giriya, ye majlis maatam noha, ye ashko ki barsat hai, ye khoon ka behta dariya. हम करते रहे हैं पे हम करते रहेंगे हरदम ये मातम शबीर तेरा ये मातम शबीर तेरा ये मातम हम मातम करने वाले हम नौहा पढ़ने वाले बेशक है दुआए ज़ारा शबीर पर रोने वाले ये अश्क नहीं है वाइज ये ज़ख्मों का है मरहम ये मातम शबीर तेरा ये मातम, ये मातम, ये मातम, शबीर तेरा ये मातम। ए मुनकिर मातम सुन ले, मातम से न रख बेजारी, ज़हरा की अमानत है ये, कर तू भी अमानत दारी। मिलता है नसीबों से ये, ज़हरा के घराने का गम, ये मातम, ये मातम, शबीर तेरा ये मातम, ये मातम, ये मातम, शबीर तेरा ये मातम। ज़ैनब ने किया ये मातम, जब शाम के जिंदानों में लगता था कयामत आई। कुफार के वानों में 1400 बरस गुजरे हैं, मातम न हुआ अब तक कम, ये मातम, ये मातम, शबीर तेरा ये मातम, ये मातम, ये मातम, शबीर तेरा ये मातम। या हुसैन, या हुसैन।
السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله، السلام عليك يا ابن رسول الله، السلام عليك يا ابن أمير المؤمنين وابن سيد الوسيين، السلام عليك يا ابن فاطمة الزهراء سيدة النساء العالمين، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا مولى ابن مولى، السلام عليك يا غريب الغرباء، السلام عليك يا سلطان أبو الحسن علي بن موسى الرضا ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا صاحب الزمان، السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن، السلام عليك يا شريك القرآن، السلام عليك يا كعبة الإيمان، السلام عليكم يا أهل بيت النبوة جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم كل وليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا.